Hi everyone, thanks again for watching. I try to make weekly accounting videos, so please subscribe so you don't miss anything, and give this video a thumbs up if you like what you see. Today we're going to be talking about Capstone 1 Essentials. It's not a clickbait that I wrote, watch this for a 99.99% pass rate, as I'm going to explain to you why later. As you might find today, this video is a little bit more colorful than usual, and that's because I'm trying to incorporate the theme of the 2022 May Capstone 1 case on Creative Toys Incorporated. So now let's talk about the overview for today. It's going to be talking about what is Capstone 1. It's going to be giving you tips on the part 1, 2, and 3 of the report, and then tips on the board presentation. And lastly, I'll explain how to get the 99.99% pass rate. So now let's talk about what is Capstone 1. Capstone 1 is the pass or fail case analysis where you usually work for a company as an employee or a consultant for them. It's focused on enabling competencies and not technical. In general, it's going to just feel like you're doing a management project in university, and it's going to be mainly focused on your performance management skills rather than accounting, tax, finance, and assurance. You will probably encounter as much technical as a Core 1 case. These projects are expected to be completed in groups of 4 to 6 candidates. If you have a smaller group, don't take it as a disadvantage, as it might be easier to coordinate schedules and to get along with your group members. The average case size is about 50 pages with appendices. You get 2 live chat calls with your facilitator, who's the one that marks your reports, so they'll be able to give you feedback and you'll be able to ask them questions. There's going to be 3 deliverables, your part 1, your part 2, and your part 3 of the report. And then there's going to be a final board presentation where you get to present your report to the board. So now let's talk about some tips on your part 1 of Capstone 1. The first would be that you want to be on time and committed to your team. You don't want to be that guy that's always late to the meetings. The second tip is that you should have an agenda going into each meeting, and you should have deliverables prior to the next meeting. So you're not just having meetings for the sake of meetings. Next, you would want to have recurring meeting times so that everyone knows exactly when they're supposed to meet and keeps that time slot free. If there are any parts of the deliverables that you're having issues with, then you should always voice up your opinions as soon as possible and not wait until the last minute when you have to submit the report. When dividing out the work, you should do a rough allocation of how many pages each person needs to write before they start, because you'll realize that the page limit creeps up on you pretty quickly. Prior to handing in any of your reports, make sure you double check with the page limit and the format, and I'll have a slide on this later in the video. You should always designate one person to submit the deliverables because you don't want to be the team where everyone thinks that everyone else will submit and in the end no one submits. Lastly, whether or not you have a revision for part 1, you should always revise your work based on the feedback and the marking key, as the information is still fresh in your head and then you don't have to wait until part 3 before you start revising everything. Now let's talk about tips for part 2. So you want to follow the instructions of what you need to hand in for the deliverables. It's clearly outlined to you every week, so if you follow that, you should be okay. It's also easier to cut down than to write more. So it's okay if you're over the page limit by 1 or 2 pages, you'll just cut down afterwards. You would also want to have a buddy system where you assign 2 people to one area, to have more accountability and to be able to have someone check over the other person's work. If conflicts arise, make sure you're able to compromise as much as you can, if it's not too much trouble. The hardest part of Capstone 1 is the team dynamics, so you want to keep the relationship as good as possible for yourself and others around you. When making the questions for your facilitator, you just get 3 as a group, so check with the CPA forum to see if your question has already been answered, so that you don't waste the time of your facilitator and you can ask other questions instead. Your facilitator can only comment on what you did, so they won't be able to tell you the answers no matter how many times you ask them. Also, you want to use up the full 30 minutes to get feedback from your facilitator. If they have answered the 3 questions that you had, and there's still time left, you should come prepared with extra questions that you can ask them. Lastly, you want to provide honest feedback of teammates so that your facilitator can help you resolve any issues. These feedback are going to be anonymous so that your teammates won't know who said it. So now let's talk about tips for part 3. Again, you want to make sure you know the page limit and the format requirements. In addition, you want to make sure that you're only submitting your final report. As you're only allowed 1 submission, you want to make sure that there's no further updates after that, because if there is, you'll have to actually email your facilitator before the submission deadline and ask them to take down the previous submission so that you could resubmit again. If you realized after the submission deadline that you uploaded the wrong copy, there's actually nothing your facilitator can do about it, which is similar to any other module that you've been in. The next tip is that there's no revisions for your part 3, so make sure you're handing in your best work. And the next tip is to remember that you want to include any revisions that you've had in part 1 and part 2, regardless of if you actually needed revisions, because sometimes you could have passed even if you left out some key points. However, you don't want to leave out those key points when it reaches your part 3. It's also a good idea to have someone to be able to read through the whole report and to have a good flow and to make sure that everything is cohesive. Maybe this person would be allocated a little bit less for their area so that they can do this proofreading. Lastly, if you get to pass part 3, you should trust in the mark that you received from your facilitator and be confident in the recommendation that you're going to be presenting to the board, and not try to question if you got the right or wrong answer, especially if you ask other groups and they recommended something that's different from yours. So now let's talk about tips for your board presentation. You are not marked on the content that you're presenting. So trust in the facilitator that they have set you up for success and that you have the right recommendation and analysis. The next point is to focus on your presentation skills, as that's what you're going to be evaluated on. If you remember back to your Capstone 1 module workshop, you all have the oral presentation rubric that the panel will be using to assess you. In addition, you should be prepared for the Q&A session. You can have extra slides of things that you have made for the appendix of part 3, which you might not have necessarily shown in your presentation, but you can flip to if there's a question later asked about it. This will show the board that you are well prepared. Next, make sure that prior to starting your presentation, you do a video and mic check so that no one is on mute and everyone can hear each other. In addition, everyone should be keeping time, so you know how much time the previous person took, so that if you need to speed up your part of the presentation, you can do so. You don't want a situation where everyone takes a little bit more time than they're supposed to, and the last person is left with 30 seconds to talk about the recommendation and conclusion. When doing the Q&A, you shouldn't add on to your teammates' answers, and you want to trust whoever answers first to give a complete response. Make sure you always have slide numbers when you present, as the board members don't normally remember the title of the slides, but they remember which number it was on. To show teamwork, you want to make sure that everyone on your team presents and has a chance to answer the questions. It's okay to not know a question. Sometimes the panel member is from the industry that the case is based on, so they might know some additional knowledge that you might not. So it's okay if what they're asking you is not inside the case. You're allowed to say that you don't know, but you will get back to them afterwards. In general, you just want to be confident in what you know, because the board members probably only read the case and solutions once, while you've been working on this for 8 weeks. Lastly, you just want to be professional and play the part. Make sure that you address the board as the board or by their role. Don't say you guys and be informal. Even if the presentations are online, try to dress your part, so you should wear business formal. You should also coordinate with your teammates so that you're not the only one in business formal while everyone else is in business casual. It's better to overdress than to underdress. I've also had candidates show up in hoodies, so you don't actually want to be that person either. Formatting is key in Capstone 1. I've highlighted what you really need to take note of, which is the word count and page limit for appendices. In addition, you will notice that the size of the margins are typically the default margins that you would have in Word, so if you haven't changed them, you would be okay. Lastly, there is a requirement on the type of font and the size of font that you can actually use. So now let's talk about why 99.99% of people watching this video will pass Capstone 1. The answer is pretty simple. There's revision opportunities for Part 1 and Part 2, which the facilitator will give you back your mark plus the marking key, which clearly shows what you actually missed. So as long as your team looks at the marking key and the feedback, they will be able to see what they missed. For example, the marking key will explicitly say that you didn't do a SWOT analysis. So what do teams do? They put in a SWOT analysis next time. However, you might say, there's no revision on the Part 3, so won't students fail there? Well, the answer is not really, because by the time you do your Part 1 and Part 2, You have the right situational analysis, you have the right strategic and operational issues and their analysis, so the recommendation should be very clear. Lastly, even at the oral presentation stage, if you mess up on the presentation, you'll even get a repeat on that as well. So basically what I'm trying to say is that if you do your part and you work as a group, you won't fail. Having said that, Capstone 1 is still going to be a lot of work, but don't worry. If you trust in the process and put in the amount of hours, you'll get rewarded in the end. In all my years of being involved with Capstone 1, I have not heard of anyone failing the report and only heard of one team failing the presentation because they were arguing with each other in front of the panel while presenting. However, they got a second chance and was able to redo it and passed in the end. This is why I believe that 99.99% of people watching this video will actually eventually pass Capstone 1, and hopefully you'll be one of them as well. To give you guys the complete picture, here's the passing profile for the individual as well. In summary, it's basically if you contribute to the group, you hand in all your individual assignments, you attend the workshop and the facilitator meetings, then you'll pass as well. As always, thanks again for watching. I try to make videos every week, so if you like what you see, please subscribe and like the video if you have not already. Hopefully this video helped you feel more confident going into Capstone 1. Feel free to leave me a comment and I'll try my best to reply.